Well, I want to thank you and Chen for this magnificent afternoon. When I came to Harlem, in 1985, shortly after Lewiston Stadium had been demolished, shortly after the spectacular William Schickel main building of City College, which had been the main building of the Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart, which they bought when they moved to Purchase, New York. That Finley Hall was demolished. And then also the former Hebrew Orphan Asylum had just been demolished. So I wanted to start some sort of preservation presence in Harlem, as I had in Akron, Ohio, where I'm from. And from that time to now, I would never have believed that there would be such a stirring and inspirational coming together of people from all over the city as this, hosted in Harlem by a Harlem organization. So you and I just thank you so very much. That's a really extraordinary thing. And then I have to thank my friend John Reddick, who some 20 years ago, I was giving a talk at the New York Historical Society about Harlem's architectural history based on my book, Harlem Lost and Found, An Architectural and Social History, 1765 to 1915. And you know, when I was brought up just around the time of the Black consciousness movement period of the 70s, we were taught that we could do anything as Black people. And we were further taught that we shouldn't be afraid of white people, that we should all ultimately just live together. And I believed that that was the way things should be. So during my talk, we were talking about Strivers Row, and John had asked some question about Harlem, what would happen in Harlem when Harlem was no longer Black. And I said, well, it's the buildings we're trying to preserve, not people. It would be illegal. It would be illegal to just say that Black people could live in Harlem. And John yelled out, "Bullshit!" And how stunned was I by that? But when John, you did. Yes, you did. I remember it as if it happened yesterday. But the thing of it is that since that time, 20 years ago, I, of course, have changed my feeling about what John said. He said further that without the people, the buildings don't mean anything. And I thought, or I've come to think more and more and more as I've become radicalized, how right he was. You know, what would Paris be without the Parisians? Or Venice without the Venetians? And furthermore, Black people were forced to live here and in Brooklyn in the first place because we weren't allowed to live in other places. And so why can't we have some place that represents our heritage and history and culture and that we should be able to afford to live in? So now, as a preservationist, I feel that one should not just preserve some mere building, that one should preserve something of the history and heritage and culture of the place as well. And that is all rooted in something else that I heard, about 15 years ago. And Simeon will probably tell me, oh no, that never happened. But what happened was Clement Price Alexander from Rutgers University gave the keynote talk at the annual meeting of the Historic District Council. And he said, until preservationists can learn to make historic preservation more interesting and important to people of color, they will run the risk of becoming irrelevant. They will run the risk of becoming irrelevant. And of course, when people were objecting to all of those Confederate statues in the South coming down, I wanted to say to them, no, you've got to work for some sort of accommodation, because if you don't, sooner or later they'll be saying, tear down Mount Vernon, tear down Monticello. For the longest time, these things were made to have no significance to African Americans whatsoever, except in terms of oppression. And what is becoming clearer and clearer, and I like to think that I've had some part in it, is that it's being recognized more and more that Black history is American history too. And the problem that I have, of course, is that it's very different from 20 years ago when, in response to my decrying how there were just, 5% of the buildings protected by landmarking on Manhattan Island, located above 96th Street. And the chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, in response to that, wrote a letter to the Times, and she said, wow, what Mr. Adams fails to relate to people is that Harlem has just as many historic districts as the Upper East Side or as the Upper West Side. And to that, of course, I wanted so much to be able to say, okay, I've got 20 bank accounts and Mr. Soros has only one. Whose bank account do you want? So this notion of equity and reciprocity has been better acknowledged by the city, because the chair of the Landmarks Commission last year said that she had talked to our new mayor and she had agreed with him that racism was a part of every entity of government in the city, including the Landmarks Preservation Commission, and that was why they were initiating this inclusion project, where they pledged to do more in communities of color throughout the city. The problem is that just a sort of lie, because they do very conspicuously create the isolated landmark here and there in communities of color. They may even give you a little tiny historic district. But when you are looking at a building in your community that you know is a landmark, well, how do you know it? Because any school child looking at that building can tell that is a special building. They say, oh no, that doesn't meet our criteria. Or, as they did with the house on Duffield Street in Brooklyn, that house which was associated with the Underground Railroad. For years, they said it was not intact enough for them to designate it a city landmark. Well, with this house at 857 Riverside Drive, they have said the exact same thing. 20 years go by, and Duffield Street, the house on Duffield Street, is now a city landmark and was acquired by the city to be restored. So we really do have to work harder, I think, to keep the people who represent us and our government honest. And even private people, like Ms. Askins, talking about how no one in the community asked for there to be any landmarks on 125th Street. It's simply not true. When they did the rezoning of 125th Street, Community Board 10, their landmarks committee came up with a list of buildings that they thought should be landmarked, and we tried to keep it a small list because we didn't want to be too extravagant. And the only building selected from that list was the public library near Amsterdam and 125th Street. That was it. So the bank building, which we all knew was a landmark just by looking at it, the Koch's store building, which we all knew was a landmark, the Corn Exchange Bank, which we all knew was a landmark, none of these buildings were protected by landmarking. And that, of course, is what the Landmarks Preservation Commission and the Landmarks Law are for, is to protect our heritage and culture here in New York City, including in Harlem. So I am so excited that there is now Save Harlem Now, and there is the West Harlem Preservation Organization, who are carrying out the work which I once hoped to do solo. And this is a marvelous accomplishment, and we should all be very delighted and thankful to Yuen Chen and the West Harlem Preservation Organization for hosting this magnificent afternoon. Thank you very much.